Now, without any further delay, let's begin today's event, the Inspiration Code, How the Best Leaders Energize People Every Day. I would like to introduce your moderator for today, and that is Tanya Schiavone. Tanya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and welcome, everyone. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Tanya Schiavone. I'm a senior practice leader at Canadian Management Center. I am really excited to moderate today's conversation because I know it's going to be a really good one. Before, however, I introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First, I wanted to extend an invitation to all of you. And my invitation is for you to be really present for our session today. We're going to talk a little bit about the power of presence, amongst other things. So this is an opportunity for you to practice being present, putting aside those distractions, and really interacting with us. Take advantage of the fact that we have a very knowledgeable leadership communication expert with us today. So as Jessica mentioned, please enter your questions in the Q&A panel. We'll attempt to answer some as we go along in the presentation, and then we hope to have also a Q&A session at the end. I do know, based on the feedback we received from you in our survey questions at this point of registration, that many of you are facing obstacles to building the level of engaged and inspired leadership teams in your organizations that you'd want to. So I know that you have questions, so this is your chance. In fact, some of the biggest obstacles that came up through the survey were things like time. It's time-consuming, the perception that it's time-consuming to be in inspirational leadership. And the other thing that really came through was that people don't feel they know how to do this. So, leaders either feel they're not inspiring, they don't know how to be inspiring, and they really don't know how to prioritize this amongst the many other things that they have on their plate today. So answers and tips and strategies to some of these challenges we'll be talking about and others. So please share your questions with us. With that, I'm going to now introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Kristi Hedges. Kristi is a Fortune 500 leadership coach. She's also a consultant. She is a global speaker, and she addresses audiences ranging from large conference audience to corporate teams to obviously webinars like the one we're hosting today. She's known for her style that's engaging, practical, and thought-provoking, and you'll find that she presents her opinion, but also it's based on a lot of the research that she has done, and she incorporates real-world stories that you can relate to. So I'm really excited for all of you to get an experience of that today. And I can also share just personally, and having spoken with Kristi in preparation for today's session, that she's really someone that is committed to having this conversation make a difference for you. So again, please have this be a two-way dialogue with us. Finally, we are going to be talking about the two of the books that she's authored here today, The Power of Presence and, of course, The Inspiration Code. Our focus will be on the Inspiration Code, and having had the opportunity to recently read that book, I would say it's definitely a must-read for every leader, and I would go so far as to say it's a must-read for anyone who really wants to make a difference in the lives of others. And with that said, I am going to hand the floor over to Kristi. Kristi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, we're sitting here in one of my favorite cities, Toronto, and I'm glad to be talking about one of my favorite topics, the inspiration we can bring to others all the time, any day. And, I say this very committedly, and one of the reasons is because Tanya talked about my background a little bit, but at my core, I'm a leadership coach. That's really what I consider the bread and butter of what I do. Everything kind of stems off from that, whether it's writing or speaking or what have you. And I see the other side of inspiration every day, and I see what people have experienced and how that's influenced and informed them and really helped them transform into the person that they are. And so when you see that other side of it and you hear the stories, it makes you quite a committed advocate of all of us being more inspiring wherever we are. So, I'll tell you how I kind of started down this little journey, and you can see the slide up here, when were you inspired? And that's really the question that started all of it. When I wrote The Power of Presence, I would go out and I would talk to audiences about that book, and I had this question where I was trying to help people understand the facets of executive presence and what that looked like, and really link that back to people who had made a difference in their own lives. And so I asked a variation of this question, when were you inspired? And I noticed very quickly that the room would transform. That people would become animated, and they would smile, and then it would get loud. And this would happen even at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday in a room where people were mandated to come, right? So they still would just like light up with these stories. And I would ask questions about that. What did somebody do that sort of caused you to be so inspired? And I started collecting these stories. And what I found was that there's a lot of similarity between what people found to be inspiring behaviors. And so if you think about the importance of that energy and that animation that you see when people, that kind of fills people when they talk about, even just talk about being inspired, and then you sort of, transpose this against the fact that Gallup's latest research has about 67% of people are either partially or almost always burned out, right? So that's the antidote, right, to feeling that way. And so, again, I started sort of looking into that. Like, what did people say that they did that caused the behaviors that caused people to be more inspired? And I found very quickly that inspirational leadership, the way we think about it in the abstract form, didn't pan out in terms of the behaviors of people who were actually inspirational leaders. And so we think of inspirational leadership as being, sort of an iconic figure on a big stage who lights up a room, sort of like Elon Musk, if you will, that kind of personality. When in fact, inspirational leaders tended to be more like, Bob in accounting, whose door was always open, who had just the right thing to say. And for a lot of people, that's very comforting because we're a lot more like Bob in accounting than we are like Elon Musk. And so, when we look at it from that standpoint, we realize that it's a lot more accessible than we think it might be.
And I think that's an interesting point because one of the things we asked our participants in the pre-survey was, what percentage of their leaders would they describe as inspiring? And I would say it looks like the vast majority felt that less than half of their leadership team, like 77%, felt that they weren't that inspiring. So I wonder if there's sometimes a disconnect if we're holding them to that standard and whether those same leaders that we may perceive maybe as not as inspiring are actually inspiring their people because, as you say, they've got their door open, they're having maybe the inspiration's happening more at the one-on-one level versus maybe the sage on the stage kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, stage on the stage. I might use that again. So I guess my research would say actually no. That's a great question.
All right, put me in my place right away.
But I like where you're coming from on that. So I got research, feedback from hundreds of leaders, what inspired them, right? And in fact, what they did was they talked about those small behaviors. They didn't talk about the sage on the stage. Mm-hmm. They talked about, very specific things that people did that were actually, many people would say they're just kind of routine leadership things, but they did them in a way that was very intentional and regular and consistent and came at just the right time, and that had a huge impact on them. And so then I did a quantitative survey, and then I reviewed 30 years of interdisciplinary social science research and found that, in fact, inspiration has pretty identifiable patterns to it. So we're most inspired when we are doing behaviors that help us to be present, when we're doing behaviors that help us to be personal, passionate, and then purposeful, and both in terms of having our own purpose, but also helping other people find theirs. And so I developed this model, which I call the Inspire Path. And it's in a path for a reason because, we don't wake up one day and we're inspired, but we help people along that path so that we produce the most advantageous conditions, if you will, for other people to be inspired.
Well, and I right away I'm just noticing that there's both good news and bad news here. So I love the fact that you said these are attainable. These are things, sort of almost everyday behaviors that we can presumably all do, which is also interesting because 89% of the folks on the line said that they felt that all of us have the opportunity to become more inspiring. Mm-hmm. Some people felt that, no, that's not the case. It's sort of like you either got it or you don't. And the reason I say there's bad news is I see words like present and purposeful, and some of the obstacles that people cited in the survey were that people are overwhelmed. People are tired. People don't have time. People may be doing roles that they're not a good fit, or they've long, lost their inspiration. So I'm sure as you talk to present and purposeful, you'll be able to comment a little bit on what do we do when we find ourselves in those situations.
Yeah, that's such a great point because one of my favorite findings in all of this research is that we actually don't need a lot of time to do this stuff. They are small, sometimes 5-minute conversations that change people's careers and change their lives.
Well, so I'm going to just repeat what Kristi said because I know we have a lot of HR, OD talent folks on the line, so the next time a leader says to you they don't have time to be more inspiring, you're going to think of Kristi and you're going to say, actually, this can happen in a 5-minute conversation. I love that.
Yeah, and in fact, many times it did. And the feedback that I heard back, they weren't big, momentous time suckers of activities, right? They were small things that people did that made a difference. And so, I think all of us should come out of this feeling more equipped to be more inspiring in our day-to-day lives. The biggest thing, though, is how we think about it. So it's not how much time we think, it's how we direct our thinking. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today is take you guys through some of what I consider the most important moves that we can make. I'm going to give 5 today. They're underneath these categories. There's more in the book. But for the sake of our best use of our time here, we're going to narrow in on 5. And again, they don't take a lot of time. We just have to think about things a little bit differently. And the great news about all of this, too, is it doesn't really matter who you're trying to inspire, whether it's your direct reports or mentors or, your work teams, external stakeholders. This stuff works great in sales, for example. So if you have a sales team that you're responsible for, then that's something that we can look at as well. It's the same stuff. And also your friends and family and yourself, right? So I tell people all the time, use this stuff at home, go try it at home because I don't parent the same way as I did, for example, before I wrote this book. I spent, years working on this, and I came out of it going, oh, my gosh, that's how that could be done. So, again, it didn't take any more time. It was just a shift in how I approach things.
No, I totally get it, and I was being completely sincere when I said that it's really a book for anybody who wants to make a bigger difference because even the piece just around listening, we think we listen, but we really don't. We listen to get through a conversation. We listen for how we're going to respond. We listen for how we're going to prove that we're right and the other person's wrong, and none of it is really listening. And just doing that alone with our kids, with our partners, with whomever can be a game changer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love learning things that help me at work and help me in the rest of my life, too. And so, I'm quite passionate about this. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say before we dig into the moves is I found this to be quite interesting. So when I started this process, I asked all of the researchers that I knew to point me in the direction of the people who knew the most about inspiration. And they pointed me to 2 professors, Elliott and Thrash, who've been studying this for 30 years. And so what they have narrowed down is actually what is happening when we're inspired. And this was a surprise to me because going in I thought inspiration was like a bolt of lightning. And then all of a sudden, you saw things differently. But in fact, there are 3 things occurring at the same time that make inspiration happen. And the first one is their idea they call transcendence, which is really an awareness of new or better possibilities. We become aware of something that we didn't see before. And when I find clients who are uninspired and I start digging in a little bit, I find that they don't have any sort of new inputs into their environment. So they're not gaining new awareness. They're doing the same thing, talking to the same people, going to the same office, right? And they kind of get into a rut. And the rut is the enemy of inspiration. Because we need some of those new inputs. The second part is receptiveness. We have to be open to it. And so you'll find this is why sometimes it's very frustrating when you're trying to get somebody to do something at work and kind of see the opportunity and they don't. Or you might find that, that there's another part of it where in yourself you might notice that at one point you might feel that, you got really excited about some sort of trigger, and the next time it didn't bother you at all. And so it's the same thing. We want to be open to the experience. And finally, the last one is motivation. We feel compelled to bring the idea into action. And so when these 3 things happen together, it's that's the lightning bolt that makes us inspired. And so I'll offer that as just a little bit of a zoom out and a level set of what we're talking about in the first place. Oh, and one thing I'll add here is that the researchers are very adamant about this, is that we cannot force somebody to be inspired. So unlike influence, where it's sort of foisted upon us, inspiration we decide for ourselves. We're the arbiters of what inspires us.
I guess it's closely linked to motivation. They say you can't really motivate other people, but you can kind of create the conditions or help them tap into their intrinsic motivators, for example.
Perfect. Perfectly said. So it's the idea of laying the breadcrumbs, I call it. So why it's a path. We create these conditions that are that will be most likely for other people to be inspired. Okay, so let's start with move number 1, being present. So this one seems like it should be pretty easy, right, because we just show up. Well, in fact, we know that there's being present and there is just our bodies being present in the room. And inspirational leaders, they think about their presence and they use their presence differently. And so what I heard frequently were things like, she was there for me. His door was always open. He always made the time. I was an intern, but she made me feel so important because she would ask about my ideas. And so the person's just sheer presence and how they showed up was very inspiring to others. Now, we know this isn't always easy. So, Tanya, you mentioned time before. There's a lot of things vying for our attention. And we do become distracted and stressed, and all of these things play a role and get in our way. I kind of describe it as sort of the toxic buildup of the day. So you start and you have a meeting, and maybe something doesn't go right in that meeting, and then you take that emotion into the next meeting, which then something else happens. And you take that emotion to the next meeting until at the end of the day you sort of have this stew of feeling. And so when we talk about being present, it's stopping that stew along the way and really being intentional about the presence that we want to bring to each interaction. And again, this doesn't take a lot of time, right? It's just a couple of moments to really get our head into the game and not let that build-up just continue.
Well, I was reflecting on that the other day. I was talking to my 9-year-old daughter who was having a conversation with me while she was playing a game on her iPad, and just something as simple as saying, my eyes are up here. Can you make eye contact with me? It changes the conversation. Like if people are trying to talk to you, but at the same time they're looking at their computer screen, your boss is looking at her phone, it's like you can't even pretend to feel like you're in a conversation with someone who's present. They say they are, but they really, if they're not meeting someone's eyes or they're really giving you that attention, you just feel completely dismissed, or at least I feel completely dismissed.
Exactly, which leads me to this next point here. Is listening feels like care and attention feels like respect.
Yeah.
And when we don't give those, the opposite is there. So why would we listen to someone? Why would we be inspired by someone who doesn't seem like they care or respect what we have to say? And so, again, just shifting how we show up in certain environments can make a big difference. And so you mentioned phones. So there's a study out of Virginia Tech called the iPhone effect. And what they found is that just having a phone on the table turned over, everything off, just there, changes the nature of the conversation. There's less empathy and less is exchanged between the parties. And that's consistent across age groups and genders. And so it's fascinating, right? Because for some reason we've learned to let that divert our attention just by being there.
It's almost like a statement that you're a priority until this phone rings or something. So it just has me rethink about, you think having your phone down is sort of okay, but maybe not. Maybe we just need to have it right out of view.
Yeah, just take it off the table. Makes a difference. So a couple of tools here. So if you want to be more present, one of the easiest things you can do is just say that you'll be more present. So that sounds incredibly obvious, but let's talk about how that goes, Tanya. So let's say we have a meeting, and you're in my office, and I say, Tanya, before we start this meeting, I just want you to know that this is really important to me. We only have 20 minutes, but I want the 20 minutes to count, so I'm going to make sure my phone's off the desk, and I'm going to turn everything off, and for the next 20 minutes, this is the most important conversation.
I would say to you, no one has ever said that to me before.
Right.
Suddenly I feel important.
Suddenly you feel important. Right? Again, it doesn't take any time to do that, and so it plays into this psychological concept of consistency, which is if we say something, we're more likely to do it. And so that's the mental trick that makes us do it, and it changes the conversation. So once you say that, you're not going to then go answer your phone because you've made this commitment to the other person.
Right.
So it's just a really simple way.
Simple but powerful.
Simple but powerful. Another thing to do is just use the pause that you naturally have. I talk with my clients a lot about situational intentions, which is the idea of before I go into a meeting or conversation, I take a moment and think about how do I want this person to feel? Like what's the feeling I'm going to try to put into the room? Because if we carry that feeling, if we know what that feeling is, we're more likely to carry that feeling. So if I want you to feel excited about what I'm saying, then I need to come in and show excitement. And so it's just that it's a mental trick to kind of get inside your body in a way, right, to determine like what is the message that I'm really trying to convey from an emotional standpoint versus just sort of the words. I want to make sure I hit this point. I want to make sure I hit that point.
But it's huge. I mean, in some of our previous webinars, we've been talking a lot to our clients about this year we'd had a theme around performance management and helping leaders shift from being focused on the process of performance management to the people. And just thinking about how you want that person to feel is a completely different way of thinking about it. It's sort of like instead of the points I need to cover on my checklist, and it will completely alter how you frame the conversation, but also in the context of performance management, right, which is very stressful, help the other person be in listening mode versus being defensive or having their brains hijacked by, stressful emotions. So if you're actually focused on the feeling, you can create more safety. And the other thing I'm thinking about, in the survey that our audience today completed, they talked a lot about being in reaction to things, being firefighting. So this would be sort of an antidote, I suppose. It's just the power of pausing before you just kind of react or overreact or inappropriately react. I'm not talking about myself, others clearly.
No, of course,
yeah.
Of course, not us. This
not
is
us.
People. But of course, something like this, I've used this is when the power of presence is where I developed this content and used it with clients, started using it with the clients. And I use it with clients all the time, and I mean, it just changes the nature of the exchange, and it's a very simple thing. We just don't typically think in emotional terms, but we process in emotional terms. And so if you want a feeling to be in the room, you're the one that needs to put it there. Otherwise, it's going to be by accident, and then that's the toxic sludge that, makes up the day.
Yeah.
It's by accident.
Well, I'd love to see how many folks in our audience actually do this. So we have a poll question for you because sometimes, we hear these things and go, well, that's pretty simple, but the question is, do you do it? So here's our question for you today. Do you actually pause to set a clear intention? So when you're going into a conversation, whether that's a performance conversation, a stressful conversation, or a conversation where you want to have, leave the employee being inspired, do you actually pause to get clear on what your intention is, so how you want the other person to feel? So please select an answer. Do remember to hit the submit button. Otherwise, we won't see your response. So we've got yes, no, or sometimes. Pretty easy. And Jessica, if we can close out the poll, let's see where folks are at. Is this a strategy that they're employing today? And here we are. And, oh, okay, so we have some people who are using it, but the vast majority are inconsistent. And then we have folks who are not. So there's definitely some opportunity to do more of this.
Yeah, and so bravo to the people who are doing it already. And even if you're doing it sometimes, that's still good because you know how to do it, right? And so if we're doing it sometimes, then it's just a small leap to do it more consistently because we understand what's important about it. And again, simple but powerful is the phrase that you said. I say that all the time. We already know how to do a lot of this stuff. We do it in different aspects of our life. We do it sometimes, and so it's really about doing it more, and that's what separates an okay leader from an inspirational one.
And we have Michelle here asking a question on whether many organizations leverage mindfulness as a means of the pause. Do you see that happening more and more in your work?
I do. I don't call it mindfulness because I think sometimes in the business context people have different opinions about that. I love the fact that it is becoming something that we're more willing to talk about. But one of the things I use occasionally to demonstrate this concept is I'll have people do a yogic breath. They'll have them have a conversation, then do a yogic breath, and then have the same conversation again. And we talk about how the conversation changes.
Oh, wow.
Just in that small pause. And it's amazing because you can have sort of the gruffest type A people like, oh, she's making me take this breath. This isn't something I want to do. Then turn around and say, oh, my gosh, that was such a different conversation. And so, of course, we have the power to have that breath anytime we want to.
Yeah.
We have the power to set an intention anytime we want to.
Fabulous. Again, practical, simple, and powerful.
Okay, so let's move to listening. So inspirational leaders, as we found, they listen differently, and that has a huge impact. So when I did the quantitative research on this, the number one cited most inspirational behavior was listening. And that was a surprise to me because I have a communications background. And I really thought it was going to be all about saying things the right way. But in fact, it was more about listening in a different way. So if you think about any conversation is really three conversations. Right? It's what's said out loud, and then it's the conversation in each person's head. And as you can see from this model here, it's not the same conversation. And so there's a lot that ends up being unsaid. There's a lot that we miss. But inspiring conversations, as I say, they take the subtext and they bring it into the text. And so the things that are unsaid make their way into the spoken conversation, and that's what makes them inspirational because they're real. We're talking about the things that we're really thinking. And the gateway into this is being good at using curious questions. And curious questions look a little bit different. They tend to start with what and how. They are meant to be expansive. They're meant to get people thinking. They're meant to create a space for people to step into versus the diagnostic questions, which are a lot of the whys and the dids and the do's. that we ask in the workplace. And so if you think about just a simple top here question, why are you here on this webinar versus what brings you here to this webinar, you can just sense how differently you would answer those questions. One makes you feel like you have to defend it a bit, and the other one makes you feel like almost you start to reflect, well, what did bring me here, right? And so we start thinking in a different way. And that causes us to create a space for people that they find to be quite inspiring. So in the book, I talk about listening shifts. And that on the left-hand column here, those tend to be less inspiring ways for listening, and they're the ones we most commonly do. We listen for facts, we listen for the text versus subtext. We listen for what we need to solve a problem, for example, or listening to judge so we can get to the bottom of something, versus the right-hand column here where we're listening differently. And so if you find yourself on one of these, think, oh gosh, I always listen to judge, I'm so good at listening to judge, then my advice to you would just be just try to listen out of curiosity more often and see what happens. Because when we test out these ideas and we see the difference that they make, we're much more likely to use them again. And so it can be a matter of just zooming out a bit and trying to have a wider aperture so that we can listen a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things we discovered in one of the last conversations we were having with folks around using open-ended questions and doing a lot more listening is people struggle with the silence. So if you're starting to change the questions you ask your employees and getting them to share more and you want to engage in more open, authentic dialogue, and you may be asking them things you've never asked them before, you're sometimes going to just get silence as people try to figure it out, and there's like discomfort, especially if it's sort of in one of those critical conversations. But I guess, the pathway to authenticity isn't necessarily a comfortable one, or, when you're engaging in more candid, open dialogue and you want to listen at a different level, you may be hearing things that may be uncomfortable.
Yeah, so Susan Scott, who wrote Fierce Conversations, has my favorite quote about silence of all time. And she says, let the silence do the heavy lifting. And I love that so much. And because as a coach, we use a lot of silence in our conversation. And I can tell you the silence is where the juice is. It's where the good stuff is. So we're often more uncomfortable with silence than the person we're talking to. Because when the person we're talking to has silence, they're often thinking.
Right.
Right? And so we feel like we have to jump in that space and fill that space up because we're more comfortable.
Or we need to have the answer because we're the leader and all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Any of the above, right? So if we can just be comfortable with the silence, just sit in it and let it do some heavy lifting, magic starts to happen. And that's also when people become inspired because their perspective gets enhanced because they have time to think through things, and that allows them to kind of have those aha moments that really make them feel, so the onus is on them to go make it happen because it's not your idea, it's their idea. You just provided space for them to find.
Well, and I guess that space communicates that we believe in them to find that answer. So that's where part of the inspiration is.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
right.
That's
a great point. Okay, so that's listening, and then we'll move to move 3, which is building potential. Probably, again, I probably said this before, but it is one of my favorite moves that came out of this research because it's so easy and has such an impact. And so I heard so many wonderful stories of potential conversations that folks had with their colleagues that just made such a difference in how they saw themselves. It's almost if I call out your potential, Tanya, I help you see something in yourself that maybe you forgot or didn't know was there in the first place. And so what managers who are inspirational are doing is they're just constantly looking for and calling out potential. And again, these don't have to be large conversations. As a matter of fact, most of the time they were pretty short. And when people recount them to me, they would say, I'm sure the person who said this doesn't even remember that they said it. But I've been carrying these words around for 20 years because it just changed the way I thought about myself. It made me go for that promotion. Right? They told me I could do it right at a time when I didn't know what I should do, and it made a huge difference. So I heard conversations like this. I see whatever in you. I see greatness. I see strategic thought. I see confidence. It doesn't whatever fits in that blank, right? You're just identified in somebody else. People would say, let me just share what I see as possible for you. You're so good at relationships. You should go into sales. You would just kill it in sales. And the person just had never thought about that for themselves, right? Because they just never put those two things together. And as leaders, often, I always say you're further up the mountain than other people are because you're a leader, so you can see further out. And that's important context that other people don't have. So part of this potential is just sharing what you see from your position on the mountain. What do you see is the potential in the folks around you? And it's incredibly powerful. And so as managers, we already know this stuff about our people. Right? We know what their potential is.
But I don't know if it's that because, we did some surveys with our folks, and people tend to avoid giving constructive feedback, but they also don't do as much of this sort of reinforcing feedback and providing this kind of, identifying potential. I don't know if we forget how important it can be, or, again, it goes back to the busyness. It's not top of mind. We're so busy on the operational pieces. But do you see leaders not doing as much of this as they could and should be?
I think they just forget about it. To be honest, I think that they don't understand how powerful it is,
right.
And then it becomes something that they just don't think about doing, or they assume the other person already knows.
Right.
So why should I tell them they're strategic? They know they're strategic. Well, because there's power in telling them that. And the other thing I see is that people will use these types of conversations, but they'll use them in a way to influence. So I'm telling you you're strategic because I want you to tackle this next client that I really need you to take. And so that feels very different,
right.
And we know when that's coming, versus being inspirational. As I tell folks, I use the acronym NATO, not attached to outcome, and say, listen, when you give this, you gotta be NATO about it. Like, you're not giving it to game them into taking some position. They can sniff that out. You're giving it because you just think it's good for them to know, and they can do whatever they want to do with it. And that feels very different.
Sure.
And so I used an example of this with my daughter, who I played an instrument growing up. I really wanted my kids to play instruments, and so my daughter tried like 10 instruments, right? She was always trying them and letting them go. And I remember I was telling her her last one was the trumpet. And I said, you're so good at music. You're so creative. You should, you're so good at that. I thought I was giving a potential conversation. And she looked at me and she said, Mom, give it up. I'm never going to be in the band in high school.
Yeah. So inspiration is not manipulation when you got an agenda attached. So NATO, I'm gonna remember that. That's interesting. And one person is commenting here. She's saying that maybe leaders don't do this because they fear they're going to lose their people. So if people think that they're ready for the next role, and people, I guess that comes into trying to hang on to talent, but then you're going to end up just having disengaged talent over time if you don't allow them or enable them to grow. You can't really.
Well, if you look at the data also, people stay for their leaders.
Right.
Stay on board for their leaders. And so, the risk is far greater that they're going to leave because they don't feel like they're supported or people don't see what they do so well, versus saying this. And again, no attachment to outcome. And just, if you try it, you see how it lands on people in such a different way. And then you also don't have to worry about how they take it. Right? Because we're not trying to game anything out, right? Just, I just want you to know that you're really good at this. And that's all you have to say.
Yeah.
So my challenge is just write down 2 people whose potential you can call out and just tell them this week and see what happens. Again, these are very short conversations. Don't take a lot of prep. You already know it. And I think if you try it, my sense is you will find that it's just not too hard to do, and it has a huge impact. So our next to last move here is getting emotional, and this one is provocative for a lot of leaders because they say, I've been trained to not be emotional, isn't that bad? And I laugh because, you might be trained to not be emotional, but work is very emotional, and then you throw in change and uncertainty on top of it, which is basically an organization I know, and emotions are running high. And so emotions are really the gateway into authenticity, which was the second most cited inspirational characteristic. So that people really know what we're about and where we stand. And so it's really emotion in service to something. It's strategic emotion, if you will. I'm not just, I'm mad, so I'm going to come in and tell people how pissed off I am. It's more, I want people to understand the stakes here, and so I'm going to think about how I should use emotion in this situation. Right? It's authentic, but there's some strategic insight around it versus it being accidental.
Well, I think there's maybe some confusion around the whole term emotional, because some of the obstacles that came out in the survey, people said that they feared rejection and they feared being vulnerable. So vulnerability is important, but showing emotion isn't necessarily the same as being emotional, like breaking down kind of thing. So I don't know what the fear, when they say fear of rejection, it's maybe, I guess when you're emotional, you've got more skin in the game, and I guess you're just being more transparent and therefore more open to judgment, or I just don't know, the fear around vulnerability and fear of rejection were a few of the comments that were coming out, so I don't know if that means anything to you.
It does, and I think we automatically go to a place of weakness, and yet, if you think of people who are really true, authentic leaders, it takes a lot of courage to show up that way, and we see it as courage. So, I use this this concept of competency and vulnerability together are part of presence and leaders. So we definitely want competency. We don't want somebody who can't get things done or, can't manage themselves. But when they add the vulnerability piece with that, in concert with that, that's so powerful for people because they see that it's a real person there.
Yeah, we have the human connection.
Right, and it's imbalance. With too much vulnerability and you're sort of a mess, right? And too much competency and you're a wall, right? So we want both of them together, and finding that balance often takes people quite a while. So, the other piece about emotion is that we catch emotions. There's a concept called mood contagion that's been well studied, and you see it all the time. When people will say there's a cancer at work or someone's a bad seed that's spreading something, that's the idea. We catch the mood of other people, and leaders' mood is the one that we catch the most because we pay attention up the hierarchy. So we know what mood our leader is in, and we know what they walked in the door feeling. We know if they slammed their coffee down. We notice all that stuff, but we don't notice when the intern does it.
Right.
Pay attention up the chain. This is also observed in apes, by the way, so there's definitely some survival skill about that.
And there's a question coming in. I would just ask the participant to hold on. The question is, are there specific emotions that we're trying to avoid? And I know you're going to talk more about the different emotions and how they get expressed coming up.
I will. Let's just put a small pin in that, and it's not going to be a long one. And so this is just a concept by Jonathan Haidt, who talks about the fact that the emotional tail wags the rational dog. In other words, much of our behavior is fueled by emotion, and we actually don't know it. And so if you've ever been involved, and I know there's a lot of organizational development and HR folks on the call, trying to get a change initiative through, you see so much emotion ruling the behavior. And so being able to just be comfortable with that and saying, I see the emotion and speak to it versus trying to avoid it or ignore it, you'll find that it's much easier to actually get something through. If you think about it, we rarely do anything that we don't feel first.
Right.
Right? And so, an inspirational leader's job is to kind of tap into that. So I put this up here because I'd like people to know this is not a new concept. Some people like to blame this emotion stuff on the millennials, and I'm taking up for the millennials here. It wasn't their idea. It's a different millennial. And so Aristotle talked about, what creates persuasion. He calls it the magic triangle. And, logic, which we already know, speaker credibility, which we already know, and the third one is emotion. And so many people are very comfortable with the left-hand side of that triangle. We just double down on logic and credibility, but we leave out the emotion piece. And that's really the resonance of sort of an inspirational message, is that we're okay talking about some of this. And so for the participants' question there about what emotion should we be thinking about here, I made this graphic actually for a client of mine around this topic because he was, he's a CEO of a very large company and had come through the company, and one of the criticisms about him was that people felt like they couldn't relate to him, right? They just couldn't get a sense of him. And he would go out to all these different distribution areas and talk to people who were in the field, and they wouldn't feel a connection. And so where I started was, well, let's expand your emotional vocabulary, right? And so I just put this together. These are the four most common emotions at work: confidence, joy, anger, and urgency. And having him sort of expand his capacity around these things to think about, like, what are you trying to put into this room? Is it joy? And if it is, use some words like exhilarated. Talk about how delighted you are, how enthusiastic you are about something. And just having him being able to name those emotions was really helpful in being able to put them into the room. Now, some people are surprised that anger is on here.
Yeah, I was when I first saw this. I thought, wow, okay, I'm assuming it's not supposed to be like an equal distribution and using all of these, or I guess, I don't know, you can speak to when that's important, I guess.
Well, sometimes
if it's the authentic way you feel.
Exactly. Sometimes anger is a very strategic emotion at work. Let's say one of your competitors steals your IP. Should you be angry? I would argue, yeah, you should be angry. And so you might want to think about other people are going to be angry.
Right.
So how can you help them tap into that anger and use it instead of just ignoring it?
Right.
Right. So being able to say, I feel let down by this. I feel like our partner really let us down. and I think it's okay to feel that way, right? And it helps other people process that emotion too. And again, that's the subtext.
Right. And if you're not being authentic, or you're trying to, rally the troops and keep everyone up, you're going to just occur as inauthentic and lose credibility.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Right. Does this person not know what's going on here? We're pissed. And so, that's where, I just use a simple graphic like this to help people start to think about it. So again, if we can't name the emotion, how can we convey it? Right? And so that's where that starts to come together. And again, in times of change and uncertainty, this stuff is so important because it's out there anyway. Right? It's like the fuzz, the static that comes across with anything you say. So I use this tool a lot called the intentionality frame. Again, this is from the Power of Presence. And it's a very simple and powerful tool. It's actually, I use it, I like it in just analog form to write it on a piece of paper, and some people like to do it digitally. Have at it, whatever works for you. But the idea here is that, we've talked about some of those important conversations, and you could use this for one-on-one or 1 to 1,000. It's the same thing, is to actually start in the middle with what that intended reaction is. So you might want to use one of those emotion words and plop that in the middle. And as you plan for that conversation, think about the points you want to make along the outside of the frame. And what I have found is working with leaders over, a decade plus, is that the points always change. When we start with that intended reaction, the points change. So they might shift, they might change altogether, but it becomes very obvious when we're out of alignment with that particular reaction. So, I use this in salary negotiations often with clients. And I'll say, okay, well, what's your intended reaction for asking for more money? Well, if I'm asking for more money because I want people to feel unsettled, like I might leave if I don't get it, well, that's one conversation, right? If I'm asking for money because I want people to know that I want them to feel relaxed, I'm a team player, right, and it's just something that I want them to think about, right, that's going to be a different conversation.
Right.
Right, so we start with the emotion in mind.
And I guess that also helps us make it about our audience, because I think sometimes when we communicate things, we're like, okay, so I want to look like I got my stuff together. I want to be credible. I want to make sure I get this across. But we're on this side of our eyeballs, so to speak, and I can see how this would be a great tool to make it all about the other person that you're trying to reach. So this is awesome.
And I can't tell you how relieving it is. Like if you have a large conversation or a speech or something like that, is to just let yourself focus on the emotion you're trying to impart versus trying to cram those points into your head so you get them exactly right, even though nobody knows what exactly right looks like except for you, right? It's actually lets you take an exhale, and you're right, get out of your own perspective for a second and get into the perspective of other people, and guess what? You show up in a much more inspiring way when you do that.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay, so our last move here, move 5, is about talking about purpose. So we've all heard of purpose-driven leaders and purposeful leadership. I didn't really know what that meant when I started this journey. I thought I did, but I learned a lot. And the reality here that I found was that inspirational leaders are really good about talking to purpose in a way that role models it for others. They lead by purpose, and they're really intentional about helping others find their purpose. And by purpose, it does not have to be your life purpose, the biggest purpose that you'll ever think of. It's really about contextual purpose. What's my purpose right now, where I am, what's important to me? And again, because a leader is higher up on that mountain, they can often see some of these threads and pull them together for people that they just don't see for themselves. So just being willing to be in those conversations is quite a powerful thing.
And I just want to say on that note, one of my favorite quotes from your book, you mentioned passion is the precursor to personal investment. And I think passion and purpose so closely linked. We spend a lot of time in our leadership development courses talking to people around, creating an environment of motivation, getting people to go above and beyond. And so I just love that. If the passion or the purpose is missing, then so is that level of personal investment, that discretionary effort on the part of the employee.
Absolutely, right. And we look for that. I mean, we look for passion and we look for emotion, too. We see how that shows up on people's bodies. Like I talk to people about conviction. I talk about that in the book. Conviction is in our bodies. We want to eyeball somebody to see how much they actually care. We can't see that over email. We can hear it a little bit on by voice, but if you have some sort of change initiative, often we want the person in front of us, right? We want to read, are they passionate about this or not? Because I'm only going to invest as much as I see in them.
Yep.
And so this model of purpose that I have up here it's really a conversational model, and we can also use it for reflection. However it works however it works for you works for me. It's in the book, and I have a lot of questions that are underneath of these. But the idea is this. It's based on self-determination theory. Deci is the researcher who put that together. You saw some of this in Dan Pink's book, Drive, if some of this sounds familiar. It's the same, based on the same research. But the idea here is that when we are doing these things, we're most likely to feel purpose. When we're doing something we're good at doing, that we enjoy doing, that's useful to us, that we see has use, that creates forward momentum, either for us or for a larger society, and that puts us in relationship to others in a way that we enjoy, we feel comfortable with, that we desire. And so, you can see that a lot of times, these things don't all come together. We might be really good at doing something, but we don't enjoy it, right? Or we might be good at doing something and enjoy it, but it's outlived its purpose. We don't really see what's moving forward from here. And so helping people kind of relate back to these for themselves is very powerful. And in using it as a reflection, if we, sort of the ratio I tell people to think for is if we're doing 4 or more of these, then we're generally very happy at work. If we're doing around 3, we're in that ambivalent spot, right? Some days we're happy, some days we're not. We might not be looking, but, we're not all that enthused or engaged either. And if it's fewer than 3, you're typically actively looking for something else. And so, I often say use this in one-to-ones, right? Ask questions about this. So you can help people find some usefulness in their job. If they don't see it, there might be a way that you can either change their role or expand their role or show them how useful what they're doing is for a larger good or for the organization. So as leaders, we have a real role here to help people rediscover or discover this purpose for the first time. And we also have some power to help them find it in different ways. And so it can be used in that way.
And presumably this is relevant regardless of generation, regardless of cultural background. Like these are sort of apply to everyone.
They apply to everyone, and they mean different things to different people. So that does pop up culturally. So you might find that different cultures might have a different understanding of what enjoyment needs to be for work, right? And that's fine. And in different times in your life, you might find that as well. So, the balance might be a little different, and the way we define these might be a little bit different, but the concepts are the same, at least in every culture I've used them with so far.
And I guess that's a good question to ask, and having people weight this, maybe what's most important to them. Is it their relationships at work versus, forward momentum or something? I don't know. I wonder if there's like a weighting process, too.
Yeah, that's probably a great way to look at it, too. So I'm going to end there and give us a little bit of time for Q&A. But, this whole point about inspiration, yes, it does take up a little bit of our mind share, but it doesn't really take up any more of our time, especially for what we get back. When we inspire, it's good as a leadership attribute because we get better performance from people. They're more engaged. All of that's great. And it's also good for ourselves because when we're in these conversations with other people about inspiration, we tend to become more inspired ourselves. So it's really a gift back to us at the same time, and it's also good for our larger society. The emotional mood contagion is real, and so a more positive workforce means a more positive environment for all the things that we want to happen, whether it's just joy at work or innovation or creativity, or the list could go on. And so I just encourage people to not look at it as something hard with sort of unknown outcomes, with something very accessible and practical with very sure outcomes. And that's certainly something that anybody can do. So my challenge for this group on our call here, or those listening later, is just, take 5 days. Take one of these moves that we talked about and just try it out for a day. Try to be more present for a day, see what happens. Try to shift listening for a day and see what happens. And you'll find that you don't have to have some magic 15-point plan. You can pick a few things that you think really feel right for you, or maybe stretch yourself a little bit, and use those as your guide for what you want to invest more of. So, Tanya, I'll end here. This is how to find me if you're interested in any of these concepts or you just want to connect. I do put articles out a lot on Forbes and Harvard Business Review around these concepts that I'm researching or that I care about. So this is how to find more information if you'd like it.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have a Q&A section. We have a few minutes for that. So if you haven't entered a question, please do that now. There's a lot of great resources on Kristi's site, a lot of articles that speak to the topics not only that we're talking about today, but for those of you who've participated in some of our previous webinars around, how to deliver difficult feedback or difficult messages. She's got some fabulous blog articles on a number of the topics that we've been talking with you today. You can also find some other free resources on our website, cmcoutperform.com. For those of you who are looking to support your leadership teams internally, you may know that we have a number of programs that align closely to the messages that Kristi has been sharing, such as our transformational leadership program, leading with emotional intelligence, storytelling, mastering the art of critical conversations, and a lot more. With that, I'm going to move it over to the formal Q&A. I'm going to just take a moment here to take a look at some of the questions that you've answered, because you've got a few going on. One of the things while I review these questions, Kristi, that had come in through our survey is one of the obstacles that people perceived were leaders that were not very self-aware or didn't have a lot of emotional intelligence. In some instances, people felt that it was technical leaders that moved into leadership because it was a way to get more money, but really the people side of things wasn't really their forte. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the order of operations, do you need to have a certain level of self-awareness? Should we be doing training around emotional intelligence before we hope to get more inspirational behaviors from people, or is it accessible sort of regardless of where you're at in terms of your own self-awareness?
Well, I think the most important gateway there is desire. Right?
Okay.
Does the person see this as a benefit? And that's where I would start. So why does this matter? And if you can get someone to understand why it matters, and often the way that they figure it out is because you help them reflect on who inspired them, right, and why they were where they are. And if they didn't have someone inspire them, what they wish they would have had based on what they saw other people have. And so you can anchor back to that generally pretty quickly. And so once you get the person in a space where they desire to get better, then I think it's just showing them how simple some of these tools are.
Right.
And that helps actually expand emotional intelligence when you use them, which is sort of the side product here. So if you are having people help to expand their emotional vocabulary, you're actually helping them see a wider range of emotions that are in front of them. So, right, I don't think it's one or the other. I think they work in concert.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I suppose if you're trying to improve even your listening skills and you're listening and you're watching the other person, the whole body and everything, you're going to start to pick up cues that maybe you were not attentive to before. So it's kind of reinforces and, as you said, grows their emotional intelligence in the process. Okay, we've got some other questions coming in. Is there such a thing as being too emotional? So we've got a question saying, I'm a very emotional person. Lately I've been and my whole body and face change, and I fear that it takes away from my intention. So I don't know if that's a fear that you hear from leaders, that they're just maybe afraid of giving too much information aware from those cues of being overly emotional.
Well, some of that is a physiological reaction that we can't help. So, for example, some people flush when they're nervous, and so you can't make yourself not flush. As a matter of fact, if you try to, it makes it worse. And so I love that question about, it takes you away from your intention. And so what I would do there if I were coaching you is I would say, the best thing to do is just have everybody understand, just state your intention up front so people understand what it is. So my intention is to have you guys feel better at the end of this conversation. You could even be somewhat authentic and say, I know, you make a self-deprecating joke, I know I tend to be quite emotional. Sometimes you can see it on my face. It's because I care so much, but I don't want to lose sight of what I'm really trying to convey here. Right, so help people decipher you as a leader, and often that's a very connecting way of talking too, because then people aren't trying to guess, and you don't have to worry so much about it. Right,
yeah, so reinforcing and clarifying that intention, that's good. There's another question here. Can you speak a little bit more to the forward momentum part of talking purpose?
Yeah, I mean forward momentum for the person's career or for their life. And sometimes even for the wider organization. So you see that in tech companies, for example, where someone feels like they're changing the market. So that might feel like forward momentum. Other times it might be somebody's learning something because they want to, go into a bigger job after this. So it's carrying them forward in that direction. So it's really, however it feels like forward momentum to the person applies there. But most people experience it personally. Am I moving forward on something, right? Can I advance here? And it doesn't always have to be in the hierarchy. For some people moving forward, it gets them closer to their goal of, working 4 days a week and 1 day from home,
right.
because that's where they are in their career. So.
Oh, I imagine it could even be at the project level. I'm thinking of another organization I worked in where I felt I was really good at my job, but for different reasons, either the budget would change or this or that, I was never getting to fruition. So you'd put in all this effort, you get all this great feedback, but then you don't actually have the impact you want at the end of the day. Could that be sort of also?
Yeah, I mean, busy work falls into this a lot
right.
too. You look at, because busy work, you lose the usefulness of what you're doing, and you lose the full momentum of what you're doing. And so it's very hard to feel inspired in a job, even if you're really good at it, right? And
yeah.
You might enjoy the content of the work. If it's not going anywhere, it's hard to feel inspired in that job.
Yeah, and you're going to just burn out, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Jennifer's asking, are there any courses I can send employees to for those who are not self-aware? Absolutely, Jennifer. I would recommend our Leading with Emotional Intelligence or Developing Emotional Intelligence. That might be a good place to start. Here's another good one. So Michelle's asking, what are some resources that you leverage to keep yourself plugged in and motivated as the leader? And I remember you saying a few things in your book to how to keep yourself inspired and motivated, but I'll let you reiterate.
Yeah, so it's really about finding new inputs, right, in whatever way that you like to absorb information. So for me, there are a couple things that I love reading new research, and that's really interesting to me, so I listen to podcasts a lot. I'll do that while I'm walking or doing something else, or I'm driving in the car. But it allows me to sort of have a kind of a wider span of information. I read a lot as well. And then the other thing is I try to be in conversation with different people. I make a conscious effort of reaching out to other coaches, for example, to see what they're doing. And then other people who, I just kind of keep on sort of a tickler list that I try to stay in regular touch with. I find that when I start to get a little bit burned out, I can pretty much directly map it back to, am I getting any new inputs, or am I just kind of doing the same old thing? I'm in a rut a little bit, and I need to just enhance my perspective. And then, a lot of times in workshops I'll have leaders sort of crowdsource that information, what's everybody do, and then compile a list. And anybody can do that. You could do it in your staff meeting and share the list, and it's amazing. You find people have like all kinds of different things that they do and that you'd never thought about.
I love it. Thank you. Well, I just want to respect everyone's time here on the line. I have a couple of final things I wanted to mention. Many of you were invited today by one of our national account directors. I wanted to let you know that they will be following up with you so that we can continue the conversation, and if you have unanswered questions, that we can support you in everything that you're up to in terms of building your leadership capabilities. I also want to take a moment to just really thank you, Kristi, for being with us today, sharing your insights, your practical suggestions. You've made this, I think, a lot more accessible, attainable, and really addresses some of the concerns that our audience had around, like, we just don't know how to do this, or we don't have time to do this. So hopefully all of you are leaving with multiple strategies that you can use yourself and share with the folks in your organizations. And I want to thank you for showing up with us today, participating. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. And I wish you a great rest of your day. Take care.